Thank you to all of you for being here in this late hour and listening so far. I'm very happy to see so many people actually stayed till then. It's very impressive. And I also want to thank all the participants in the workshop. We had, I think, a very productive week, and it was fun for me to host all of you. And thank you all for participating and coming to Israel. Most of you for the first time. This is not starting, so I'll try again. Okay, of course this did work before. Let's try it. There it is in the back. Okay, cool. So, the Mediterranean. Okay, so we talked about all these beautiful coral reef fish, all these nice things to see. We didn't talk about the Mediterranean at all, right? Because most of us, especially here in Israel, when we go to the Mediterranean, we probably go there for the beach, right? We go to the beach, we go and sit in the sun, we play matkot, we call it in Hebrew, right? That's a typical Israeli thing to do, very crowded. And we don't really go and look into the water, right? And the reason, now just think about it, what you think about when you think about the Mediterranean fish, right? You don't think of something so interesting, right? So let's put our goggles on, okay, and go into the water. Okay, and this is probably what you see if you go into the beach right here in Tel Aviv. So don't see anything very interesting, or that's what you think. It's probably going to be very sandy and murky, but you have to remember we're looking at a very particular habitat and very shallow waters, right? We can also look at different places. For example, what happens if we look a bit deeper into a nature reserve? This is from Aviv. A picture taken by Andy Aronov from Avidag. This is a picture taken by free diving. So not scuba diving, so they don't have bubbles, so you can see the fish much better. And this is all in the Mediterranean. So it's not as colorful as coral reef, but it's very, very diverse. A species of lobster that's becoming very rare because of overfishing. Now it's a protected endangered species in Israel. You're not supposed to eat it in restaurants anymore. And that's a species of grouper, the Karasleim, that's also becoming rare. So in terms of biomass here, I don't know how to do it. Better, huh? Yeah. More? Okay. So I'm showing you this here. This is a breeding aggregation of groupers, the karim, that are very highly esteemed by fishermen. They're very expensive. And they come together to breed. And the reason that is important because it makes them very, very vulnerable to fishing. So one fisherman can actually take the whole population from a single area. Okay, so this is what we saw from a nature reserve in the north. But what happens here just off the coast in Tel Aviv? Let's move just a little bit deeper, just over here, and see what we get at, instead of 10 or 20 meters depth, what happens when you go down to 100 meters. Now, until a few years ago, we had no idea what's happening over there. Here you can see the depth of 96, 95 meters deep. And what you can see is a beautiful sponge garden, very diverse, full of fish, sponges, other invertebrates. It's pretty amazing, and we didn't know anything about this till like a couple of years ago. Now, these reefs are formed on hard substrate. It's basically these sandstone reefs that are also on the land, We have parallel reefs in the ocean at different depths, and by forming a hard substrate, they allow this beautiful, diverse reef to form. They're not coral reefs, they're sponge reefs, the difference. This is a picture taken by the Nature and Parks Authority. Very romantic song there in the background. So the Mediterranean isn't that boring, okay? It's actually quite interesting. but why still when we go into the water we usually see something that's exciting, okay? Why don't we see these coral reef fish? Why does it look like that? So to understand it a bit more, we really have to look at a broader scale. We can't just look at Tel Aviv. We have to get the concept of the Mediterranean and talk about biogeography. So biogeography is studying where the animals come from, how they relate to the physical environment. And looking at the Mediterranean, it's easy to see that it's very different than a regular ocean. It's an enclosed ocean, right? It's surrounded by dry terrestrial habitat. And the only entrance to the Mediterranean is through the Gibraltar, right? So water always comes from the Atlantic through Gibraltar into the Mediterranean. Now this water is very rich, very cold, full of nutrients, full of oxygen. Now it comes through, right? And then algae use the nutrients, fish eat the algae, all that happens on the West Mediterranean. Now the water goes closer to our region, becomes poorer and warmer and less nutrient rich, and it can support a lower biodiversity. So even unrelated to any human impacts on diversity, in our region we have less fish and less diverse fish community, okay? There's nothing we can do about this. This is a fact of life, okay? The other implication of having this very narrow straits over here in Gibraltar is that these straits tend to open and close with geological history. Unrelated to climate change, earthquakes might close the Gibraltar Straits, or might open it, okay? And when it closes, you can guess what happens. If it's closed sea, and you close the only opening, then water will evaporate. The rivers are not enough to actually compensate for that, and the whole thing might dry up. And this happened a few times in history. And what you'd get is almost no water at all, or very small hypersaline lakes, just like the Dead Sea. And it's interesting because this actually caused deposits of salt in the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, just like the Dead Sea. So there's about a kilometer of salt in the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, when this happens, of course, there's almost no fish or other fauna that can survive in such saline conditions. So all the biodiversity kind of went extinct a few times in history. Other implications are that animals from North Africa, and this was wetter back then, could actually walk to southern Europe. Now, when the water came back in, it means that these species were stranded on islands. So in Crete, we had an elephant, but like many animals on islands, they changed their size and became actually very, very small. So we had a tiny elephant on Crete, and so a tiny hippo on Cyprus. These eventually went extinct, but just interesting to see these island effects. The opening of the Strait of Gibraltar, the last time they opened, about 5 billion years ago, allowed species to come in. And the species that came in are mostly species from northern climates, because it was a cold times, and northern species went all the way down to North Africa. So we get cold species coming into the Mediterranean, and these species in our region are really in the edge of their distribution. So for them, it's very warm and very low nutrients, so very nutrient poor. So these species already are kind of at the edge of the distribution. So you can imagine what happens with climate change, as many of these species might move, right? They might move north to Europe. They have interesting effects, biogeographic effect, affecting the diversity in our region compared to other regions of the Mediterranean. Now, on top of that, we have other effects too. And the thing we probably think of when we talk about effects on marine environment is fishing. And fishing effects are very, very strong, and you've seen it in most of the lectures before. I'm going to show you a small example from southern France, from Banyuls, where Michel comes from. And we did transects over there. We dived and counted the fish in a small nature reserve. It's a very, very small nature reserve. And we get a very, very high diversity of fish, and also very big sizes. So we have very large groupers and very large schools of other fish. Now, if you go just a bit out of that marine protected area, just a bit out, and you see still quite a few fish, but they're very, very, very small and not so diverse. Okay, so the effect of marine protected areas is very, very strong, but also very local, which is interesting. So what happens in Israel? Why didn't I do this study in Israel and I had to go all the way to France? Well, in Israel, if you look at it, the green here are protected areas that the Nature and Parks Authority would like to place in place, but they're not there yet. And the only marine protected areas which we actually have now are in dark blue, okay? And you probably need a magnifying glass or a telescope or whatnot to actually see those, okay? So there are very, very few marine protected areas in Israel currently, meaning that we're not really protecting the nice diversity we do have. Another thing that might affect fish diversity, of course, is more commercial fishing, okay? Not local fishing in these small coastal pockets, but commercial fishing by fish trawls. And what trawls do, they drag this huge net on the floor, mostly on soft bottom, and they basically take almost anything with them. The question is, what's the impact? So most of you probably have a hunch, okay? Some people are really against trawl fishing, some people are for trawl fishing, but we feel this needs to be verified with real data, okay? What's really happening in our region of the Mediterranean? And the way we got to it, study led by Itai van Rijn from my lab, is first of all to look at data by the fishermen themselves. So there's one fisherman we work with who for 35 years has been recording every time he went to the sea how many fish he caught from each species or each group of species. This is really amazing. And he used the same net and he had the same boat and the same equipment and the same guy, okay? So it's really, really cool. So we had these very detailed diaries. So we digitized it. It was a lab effort. And what do you think? What do you expect to see? Do we see a huge increase in the number of fish, a decrease? What do you How many think that numbers went up of fish? Oh, wait, one. How many think the numbers went down? Okay, that was our hands too, right? And the reality is that we didn't see too much, okay? This is 1975, okay, 35 years ago, cold season and warm season. This is the number of boxes of fish, okay, the total biomass basically of fish. And it didn't go up or down as far as we could tell, okay? This is very interesting and suggests that either there was a large decrease before this fisherman started the diaries, or that there's no substantial change in the biomass of fish this fisherman can get out of the sea. That's interesting. But we also tried to look at something else, not only at the total catch, but at the difference in lengths, okay? Maybe we're getting the same amount of fish, but maybe we're getting smaller fish, for example. So to do that, we looked at it's called the length frequency distribution. And this is for a species called the common Pandora, gerbida, for local people who know the local name of the fish. And you can see here the size frequency distribution. This is the size of the fish. Okay, we're getting many small individuals and just a few larger ones. Okay, this is in the fall. In the springtime, all fish are growing, right? So we're getting larger size small fish, but again, we don't see very many large fish. Now we can relate the size of the fish to their age. We can look at the small bones called otoliths in their ears, calcium carbonate substructures. And when you cut them, you can see these bands inside. You can see how old they are. And that also helps us determine that they're not small because they're very old and grew very slowly, but they're small because they didn't reach adult age, okay? And you can compare the observed distribution with what we could expect from simulations, from models. Now, as you can guess, if there's no fishing but only natural mortality, you get more small fish than large fish, okay? That's natural because some fish die, right? But you have a peak of small fish, smaller peak of medium-sized fish, and then you have a peak of larger fish. You have some large fish in the community. That's according to the model. But when you increase the fishing pressure, the fishing mortality, you're getting more and more small fish relative to the large fish, because the large fish are fished, right? They don't reach old age. They die young. And you get a peak that's a very strong peak with no smaller peaks over here, no large fish whatsoever. This is very similar to what we actually see in the data. And this suggests there is strong fishing pressure, which is substantial, okay? But we don't see it in the data because we're getting more small fish but less large fish. So the total catch might be the same, even though the ratio between small and large fish might have changed. In addition, the previous data from the fishermen, we didn't separate different groups of species. We might have had changes in species composition, where some species increased and some species decreased, but the average did not change, okay? So we talked about fishing quite a lot now, but one of the major impacts in our area, which is also very unique to our area in a way, is the impact of invasive species. So this is the Red Sea over here, and here is where all the tropical species are, okay? This connects us to the previous lectures. Coral reef is very diverse, very beautiful, but it was always isolated from the Mediterranean, right? There's no waterway to go through until the opening of the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal changed everything. It was opened about 150 years ago, a bit less. In the beginning, there was no movement of any organism because they had to pass through the great and small bitter lakes. They're very, very saline, and most animals can't survive in them. But slowly, this salt dissolved. It became more and more like regular seawater, and species started to cross, okay? Many species started to cross. Fish, other invertebrates, anything you can imagine. This is the number of fish species. This is time and fish species, and you can see it's going up. It ended here about 60, and this is in 2005, but it's completely dated, right? So now in 2014, we have, I think, 90-something fish species already. So already 50% more than we had just 9 years ago. And it's continuing to go up, okay? So we have a huge increase in the number of fish species. But the same thing is true for other groups. So what are the implications? What do we care about all these species coming in, right? We might have heard kind of doom and gloom scenarios, but what do we really care? So there are a few things, okay? I want to be frank about this. So there are good things and there are bad things. And this is a picture taken from the fish market in Akko. And what's interesting here is that 100% of the fish you see here sold at this stand in the market are invasive species, okay? So they do have a very strong economical impact here. People are using them, and actually native species that are going down actually replaced somewhat by invasive species. So not everything is bad in this invasion. On the other hand, we do have also very problematic effects. One example is this striped cat eel over here you might have heard of. His name in Hebrew is Nasrallah, okay? His name is Nasrallah, which is the bad guy from Lebanon for us. It's named that way because it's venomous, okay? It has 3 spines on its back and its fins. It's very, very painful. I think the records that he killed some, that people died, not in Israel, but in other places?
A lot of hospitalization.
A lot of hospitalization. What?
Not the fish.
What not?
Yeah, the fish were not.
Okay. I got it. Now, the reason they're problematic, not because we're afraid that they're going to attack divers or snorkelers and poison them. The problem is that they come out in really large quantities with the fishermen in the nets. Now, think of a fisherman. You're trying to get like 2 or 3 fish that you want, and your whole net is just full of the species, right? And you have to start looking for the fish you can sell in the big net. So it's really problematic. So fishermen hate it, and it's a very big economical problem in Israel and other places in the Eastern Mediterranean.
They can eat?
No. Anything you can eat, but disgusting, I think. And they're small also. Yeah. Another fish I want to highlight is the lionfish. Now, the lionfish you probably all saw in the diving in Eilat and the Red Sea. It's very beautiful. We know it's dangerous, but it's kind of, it never attacks people, so it's not a problem, really. And it's actually invasive, not invasive, it's been seen in the Mediterranean, but it's not very common, and it's okay. But in other places, like the Caribbean, this species was released probably by the people that had an aquarium with the lionfish, and they didn't want it anymore. They threw it into the ocean, and it became super abundant there. And every place in the Caribbean has a very strong effect on the local species because they eat it, and they eat especially small fish. And it's a really huge problem there, and tourists are encouraged to kind of spear them and kill them, and restaurants are encouraged to sell them, so people eat them instead of having them in the ocean. It's not going to work, right? And it's just spreading it crazy, and going all the way up to New York, right? So Long Island Sound has seen these species in the summertime, which is amazing. So these are problematic species, but I think they're nothing compared to this species, right? It doesn't look very scary. And this species is called a rabbitfish, and it's still not very scary to hear a rabbitfish invading, right? But these species are herbivores. And connecting to Sebastian's talk, we didn't have any local herbivores in the Mediterranean, or one herbivore in the Mediterranean, really. One is very successful, apparently. And when the 2 species of rabbitfish invaded, they started eating all the plants. So the Mediterranean looked probably like this, maybe 50 years ago. A lot of algae, different kinds of algae also seagrass. These form nurseries for small fish. So small fish hide there and they're protected from enemies. So that increases the biomass of fish in general. And when the rabbitfish came, they transformed everything to barren rock. So almost nothing. So now if you dive in many places, you just see rock. There's almost nothing. And if you cover it with the cage that prevents the rabbitfish from grazing, all the algae does come back. So these species have a huge effect on the whole ecosystem structure and the whole seascape structure. So invasive species can cause severe problems. So what we're really trying to understand now in the lab, to some extent, is to try and guess if we can see, okay, so all these species now live in the Red Sea. And we're trying to guess, can we see which species is going to be invasive? Okay, can we guess who's going to be the next invasive species? It's important to know, and also interesting intellectual problem, right? Can we understand the system enough to know which one is going to be successful and which is not going to be successful? This kind of diversity of fish from the Red Sea, I didn't even choose them particularly, and I'm going to have a small game here. I'm going to point at species, and I want you to guess whether it's invasive or not, okay? Whether we see it in the Mediterranean or not, okay? So this species over here, who thinks it's invasive in the Mediterranean? Okay, if you're there. Who thinks this species is invasive in the Mediterranean? Okay, but more people think so. Who thinks this has been seen in the Mediterranean? Okay, less people, right? Who thinks this species, for example, is seen in the Mediterranean? Okay, only one species. Okay, so all these species are invasive, okay, just so you understand. So all these species have been seen in the Mediterranean. Some of them are highly invasive, some of them just seen a few times. And you can see they cover a really large range of trait values, sizes, diets, okay? So it's surprising that not just one group, many groups are successful here. So still, how can we guess which are going to take over the Mediterranean? Who's going to be the next Nasrallah? What's the current enemy? I don't remember. Anyway, so who's going to be the next enemy? Or who's going to just not make it, not survive in the Mediterranean? So as Sebastian talked in the last lecture, we can use ecological traits, right? All these different things to kind of characterize a species and see whether that can help us understand which is going to be invasive and which won't be invasive. And you can also look at the climate. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And these are some results, okay? What you see here on the x-axis is year, okay, just time, since the first invasive year. And what you see in the y-axis is kind of complicated, but it's the number of Mediterranean species, okay, that are similar in traits to an invasive species. Okay, so if an invasive species has many neighbors, it means it's occupying some function that's already taken by native species, right? If he has no neighbors, or very few neighbors, it means he's occupying some place in some function in the ecosystem that's relatively empty. Now, these open circles and these confident intervals, Reza Bar Semach, or like the null model, what you'd expect if they would enter by random, okay, just random entry of Red Sea species into the Mediterranean. And the black circles are what you actually see. So we see there are less neighbors to these species than you expect by chance. And this seems to suggest that invasives tend to go into these empty niches, right? So rabbitfish found the niche relatively empty. There aren't too many herbivores, and that's why managed perhaps to successfully invade the Mediterranean. So there is some effect. It's not huge, but there is some effect. So invasives tend to come into relatively empty niches. Now, climate might also have effect. We know that the Mediterranean is a very seasonal ocean, right? So it's relatively cold in the winter time. It can be debatable. Some people here are from very high latitudes, so it's relative to that it's kind of warm. But relative to a tropical sea, it's kind of chilly in the winter time, right? But in the summertime, it's very, very hot. It might be even much hotter than tropical seas. It goes up to 30, One? Okay. It gets really, really, really hot. Much hotter than many tropical oceans. So we try to see whether climate can help us understand which species invade. But thanks to these maps you showed before of the native range of a species, you can see where the species exist in the Indo-Pacific, for example. You can see where its range limits are, what limits him, what kind of climate is typical of where he likes to live, where he actually lives, and to see whether it can help us predict which species is invasive and which isn't. I got a few results here. The first thing you can see here is the temperature range, so a difference between temperature in the summer and temperature in the winter time, okay, and this is degrees Celsius. For alien species, okay, so an invasive species basically, and non-alien species, you can see that alien species tend to have higher temperature range. So they tend to come from areas that have both a hot summer and a cold winter time. While those that don't make it, these are Red Sea species that didn't make it into the Mediterranean, have a lower range. So there's some effect of species preferring the Mediterranean, which is interesting, but you can also see the effect is not that huge, right, across all species. It's not amazingly huge. The second thing we could do, and we did, is to compare the species in the Indo-Pacific, the climate where they actually are seen, whereas the places are actually seen in the Mediterranean. Okay? Now there might be overlap there, meaning that species are limited by the climate. Okay? So species going to the Mediterranean, they go to the places where they could go according to the temperature or salinity or anything else, but they can't expand any further. That's one possibility. Other possibility is that species might expand much further in the Mediterranean, more than you'd expect according to the Indo-Pacific. For example, if they have less predators or less disease or something else limits them in the Indo-Pacific that's released in the Mediterranean. And that's what we basically find. This is a map of niche expansion. So where species are seen in the Mediterranean, where we don't see them, we don't expect to see them according to their climate in the Indo-Pacific. And see there are many places, especially, let's say here around Turkey and Greece, we don't expect too many invasives because it's colder than what they actually usually experience in the Indo-Pacific, but we still see a lot of invasive species. This is looking across all these invasive species, saying what proportion of the range in the Mediterranean is into new climate. And some of them are very restricted to where we'd expect to see them in the really warm areas over here. But many species can expand into completely new climates. We don't expect them to be there. So we see some signal of kind of climatic constraints, but then a lot of unexplained variance. So these are kind of macroecological, biogeographical approach to look at the statistical patterns. But you also wanted to understand, like, really what do invasives, how do invasives affect native species? So what is the real impact? And that you can't really do with these observations. You really have to do experiments. This is something we started just a few months ago by a student in my lab. And we can reconstructing these artificial structures in the Mediterranean. And here you can see the lab actually making them, which is really cool. And after a month, it's really full of fish. And the idea is to kind of play around with the abundances of the natives, or the invasives, take them out or add them in, and see how they affect the native species. So eventually, we hope this will give us a good idea of what the actual effect of invasives are in the native species. So what I hope to show you is a bit more about the Mediterranean, show you about the problems we're facing here with fishing, with invasive species, but also to give you hope, okay? So protected areas do work, and there is what to conserve. We shouldn't give up on the Mediterranean. It's a very cool place. Coral reefs are probably cooler, but there's still a lot to see in the Mediterranean, and we should do our best to conserve that too. It's under our nose. So thanks the lab, people in the lab, and of course Michelle, which is here, and Valeriano, and other people I've been collaborating with on these projects in the last few years. So thank you.